It's time for this week's episode of Brandon Sports Talk, featuring in-depth interviews from those who are trending in the world of athletics. And now, here's the host of Brandon Sports Talk, Brandon Pate.
Welcome back to Brandon Sports Talk. In today's episode, I have the privilege to interview the Athletes to Adult Sports podcast host, Danielle Day. How are you doing today?
I'm good. Thanks for having me.
Can you talk about how you knew that you wanted to start a sports talk podcast?
So I started Athlete to Adult in the fall of 2020. I was a swimmer all growing up, and then I swam at the University of Kentucky. I went on to law school and graduated in May of 2020 and started a job as an attorney in the fall of 2020. Kind of struggled through the beginning of learning how an office works and all the real life things that no one really teaches you about. I also have a younger sister who graduated from undergrad in 2020. And so going through myself and my husband figuring out how to be adults, and then also helping my sister and some other folks we know around her age, I just realized how much there was that no one talks about, no one teaches you about preparing for adulthood. And those are, there's a bunch of different stuff that falls in that category, but there's so many people who have gone through this transition from athlete to adult. And I really wanted to create a community where we could talk about our stories and share our struggles and how we dealt with finances and fitness and nutrition and social interactions. And so I just started with kind of a basic Instagram. I love Instagram. I'm not on TikTok because that's like too much for me to deal with. So Instagram with a website and a blog, and recently started a podcast, which I love because I love hearing people's stories.
What was that like, obviously going to Kentucky and obviously swimming and then going into obviously owning a podcast for athletes to adults?
It was great. My athletic experience taught me so much about drive and determination and teamwork and just so many things I don't think I would have learned otherwise. And that kind of carried into law school, which was my first foray into kind of life without sports. And I kind of tried to separate myself from sport for a while, but I ended up coaching a club team and having the opportunity to work with the University of Florida women's swim team as a volunteer assistant coach while I was in law school. So I learned a lot of lessons while I was an athlete, and then I transitioned into my life where I was no longer an athlete, but I kind of stuck around the sports world a bit and have carried that through. Even though I work in my day-to-day real life as an attorney, I love Athlete to Adult and the community that I'm creating for myself and for other folks who are going through that transition to adulthood.
Of course, as you talked about, obviously being a volunteer assistant for Florida Gators for their swimming program, what was that like, obviously getting into that role and transitioning into adulthood during that time?
It was really good. I learned a lot about myself and a lot about swimming, and I really enjoyed kind of taking on that mentor role. I obviously was able to coach the girls, but they had just recently split their program. So they went from a male-female combined team to separate male and female teams. And I was able to work with the female team and just help them through the year. And there's a lot going on. I mean, now we have COVID, so there's even more kind of tumultuous stuff going on, but it was really nice to be able to use my own experience to help the athletes through whatever they were going through, mostly in their sports lives, but also in their personal lives, because, we know that there's nothing that's completely separate. It's pretty difficult if you're going through stuff at school or socially to leave that all behind when you're performing as an athlete.
How did you come up with the name of your podcast, Athlete to Adult?
It wasn't a very complicated process. I played around with a couple other ideas, but this is kind of what I came back to. I wanted people to know when if they see the Instagram or they see the podcast episodes, that I wanted them to know what they were going to get. And we talk about all aspects of that transition from athlete to adult. So it not anything complicated, just came up with the idea, and the URL and the Instagram were available. So that's what we went with.
What was it like, obviously, first starting the brand into a sports blog and then transitioning into the podcast industry?
It's been interesting. It's been a really nice outlet for me. I'm used to balancing a lot of things on my plate, and I honestly think I function better in all aspects of my life when I have a couple different things going on rather than just a single thing to focus on. So I really enjoyed. It forces me to network and get into contact with some older friends and teammates that I have, and to make new connections through those old friends sometimes. So I really enjoyed it as kind of a creative outlet.
What do you cover on your podcast, Athlete to Adult?
Like I mentioned before, we talk about any aspect of transitioning from athlete to adult. I have had a couple different folks on and just really tell their story. Some people that are have graduated recently, but then I've also had some folks on, like Christy DeWitts. She was the most recent episode, and she was a fitness influencer for a while, and now she's a successful real estate agent. I've had people like Nick Days on to talk about personal branding, and some folks on to talk about skill specific stuff that can really help people going through the transition, but then also some folks on to talk about their own experience in the transition and kind of lessons learned and what other folks can learn from their experience.
What is that like, obviously, hearing from the former college athletes and hearing their transition from, obviously, college athletes to being adults and working in the real world?
It's always fun. I mean, there's tough and sad parts to everyone's story, but I really think that everyone's story is unique, and we can all learn from each other's transitions. My transition is not like my sister's or my friends or my friends' friends, but I think everybody can learn from my interest in personal finance and the couple things that I've learned that you may not know if you haven't taken a personal finance course or taken up your own interest in it. So I just have really enjoyed hearing people's stories, getting people to talk about themselves. I really think that everybody's story is worth sharing and learning from.
Of course, how do you go about finding the people that you get on?
There's a couple different ways. Most of it is speaking to my old teammates and friends. The swimming world is not all that big, and so there's lots of people, whether it be at the club level, during recruiting, or college. There's a lot of different folks who I've made connections with who have had really different life trajectories, and so I've tried to go back through and make some connections that way. And then some episodes that we've already had and some that will be forthcoming are friend of a friend type of connections. And there are a ton of people in this space that are creating, whether it be Instagrams, blogs, podcasts, creating communities, and providing resources to former athletes. I've tried to connect with those people, kind of like internet friends.
What is it like, obviously, for you to balance, obviously, being a podcast host, but also being an attorney and a lawyer?
It's fun. I mean, there's times when I need to let my regular job as a lawyer take precedent, and that's just how it's going to be. But I truly think that doing this makes me better at my day job, because this is it's just a passion project, and I think that I can add value here and practice, just like we're doing now, practice public speaking and work on my network. And so there's a lot from the athlete to adult experience that I'm able to apply to make myself more successful as an attorney.
Of course, how has your podcast helped you into the lawyer you are now?
Just like I was talking about, it's helped me become more willing to, make a cold email or a cold reach out over, for the podcast, I do it mostly over like LinkedIn or mostly over Instagram for the podcast, but it makes me more comfortable in person doing some cold reach outs like during networking events, and then same thing on Instagram or on LinkedIn for work. So that's one part of it. The other part of it is just comfortable speaking and sharing my story, whether it be in a remote setting like this or maybe one day in person speaking events. Kind of no matter what role I'll be in, I think that public speaking and being comfortable sharing my story is a really important part of my career outside of athlete to adult.
What are some of your future plans with athletes to adult?
I would love to just continue the Instagram presence, trying to keep up with some good consistency there, and same thing with the podcast. Just keep interviewing interesting folks, whether that be people just sharing their story or providing some specific resources to our listeners. And then I would love to one day maybe get in the habit of speaking to student athletes in person, doing like seminars or those kinds of things on specific narrow topics, whether that be personal finance, or I wouldn't be qualified to give nutrition talk, but exercise generally, body positivity, mindset. There's a lot of things that go along with preparing student athletes to kind of make that transition to the real world, and it can be pretty tough because when you're in it as an athlete, you're going to be in it and you don't want to put your blinders on and not look outside. So I think that eventually I'd love to pull together an in-person speaking series that hopefully can broaden student athletes' minds and horizons into stuff they're going to need to know after they graduate.
Of course, with athletes to adults, do you only primarily interview the former college players that didn't make it pro, or do you also interview those players that made it pro that are after their retirement time?
So we actually do both. My younger sister has been a guest on our podcast, and she was a professional swimmer for one season in the International Professional Swimming League, and she's been to multiple world championships and other international events. She was at the Tokyo Olympics. That was her last swimming, I guess, as a professional. So we do both. And you don't have to be a former athlete to be on the podcast and to share your thoughts and insights, but I try to stick around that athletics world just because there's something there that it can be hard to understand unless you've been in and around it.
What is that like, obviously hearing from the former college athletes that once they obviously finish their college time versus hearing from the former professional players that once they finish their professional time, they go into the adult world?
I think there's a lot of similarities actually between those people who enter the real world after a college experience when they're in their early 20s versus maybe a professional athlete who spends 5 to 10 years in the professional sports league. There's a lot of questioning yourself, a lot of separating your identity from that athletic piece. And I think to some extent, you're always going to be an athlete, and that's always going to be part of your identity. But everyone has their own journey of determining how much of their identity is going to be wrapped up in that athlete piece. Some folks that are going from college or from professional sports, maybe they want to be coaches or play some other role where their day-to-day life is steeped in sports. So they probably are always going to keep that athlete identity versus someone who might want to go into finance or nutrition or being a lawyer, and you might choose to completely dissociate from that athlete identity. And so I think there's a lot of similarities. There's some differences. The folks that will have gone pro, spent a couple of years learning the more business side of sports, where they're dealing with contracts and taxes, and people are trying to make a profit and all of those kinds of things that you don't necessarily see as a college athlete. But I think kind of the more emotional side, the emotional turmoil and decisions you have to make can be really similar, regardless of what time in your life you're making that transition.
Of course, what are some of your future plans when it comes to the podcast? Do you plan on interviewing those professional athletes that obviously just recently retired and getting into the adult world?
I would love to interview some former pro athletes. I don't have in my network a ton automatically, so my focus, because of who I have access to and who I'm familiar with, is more on the recent college graduates and folks that are a little bit older than that. But I would love to expand our reach and interview some former pro athletes for sure.
What advice would you give those college athletes that are transitioning into being college athletes to going into the corporate world?
I would say give yourself grace. No one expects you to be perfect. And I think it's really hard, especially if you've made it to college sports and even professional sports. You are chasing perfection. Even if you realize perfection can't be reached, it was really tough for me to understand that I was being paid to do a job that everyone knew that I didn't know exactly how to do. And I didn't know everything. There was stuff I knew that I didn't know. There was even more stuff that I didn't know that I didn't know. And it took a little bit for me to realize that that's okay, and that's how it's supposed to be. And if I just take it one step at a time, one lesson at a time, and be kind to myself and to others as I'm navigating it, that it could be really successful, even though I starting out from a place where I wasn't necessarily on sure footing.
What advice would you give those people looking to go into the podcast interviewing college athletes that are former college athletes?
Just do it. I think that it's really fun. I love sharing everyone's stories and learning from all the folks around us. I think that telling your story is a really important part of making our world a better place. I think there's lots of value for us and for the world if we talk about the good and the bad things that we're going through. So if you're looking to start a podcast of really any kind, I would say go for it. I mostly record through Zoom, and I use Anchor to edit and release the podcast. And it's really not too difficult if you just have a computer and maybe some headphones or a microphone. So it's worth it to try it and to learn something new. Has been really fun.
That's great advice. Where can my listeners find your podcast, Athletes to Adult, on social media and podcast platforms?
So we have a website that's www.athletetoadult.com. You can find us on Instagram at athlete-to-adult, and you can find our podcast on Spotify, on Apple Podcast, and I think most places where a podcast can be found. It's called Athlete to Adult, and the logo is it's like pink and navy, and it has a picture of me on it, if that's helpful.
Thank you again, Danielle Day, for your interview, and best of luck in your future with Athletes to Adult.
Thank you so much for having me.
You can find Brandon Sports Talk on Facebook at Brandon Sports Talk, Instagram at Brandon Sports Talk, Twitter at Talk_Brandon, and you can find me on YouTube at Brandon Sports Talk. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. Thank you again, Danielle Day, for your interview, and best of luck in your future with Athletes to Adult.
Thank you.
You've been watching Brandon Sports Talk. Please feel free to like, share, and subscribe to Brandon Sports Talk on social media and on YouTube.